Hey guys, I'm Georgia and welcome back, or if you're new here, welcome. Today I have a piece of dark history I want to share with you, a piece of history that a lot of people probably wouldn't necessarily consider to be dark, or maybe it's something that most people just wouldn't consider at all. But this was real, it was nefarious, and the repercussions of it are still felt even today, especially for those of us in the LGBTQ plus community. That's right, we're dealing with another dark part of queer history today in the form of the Haze Code, delving into what it was, why it was put in place, and how it still has an effect today. Yes, this is another queer history episode, but it's also not all queer history. This is just history and it really affected the queer community. So I beg you, even if you're not part of the queer community, please stick around because you might learn something new. So before I get into the history leading up to the Haze Code, I should probably start by giving you a basic overview of what it was, otherwise we're all going to be very confused. So the Haze Code is an informal name for the Motion Picture Production Code, which was a set of rules that American media, specifically films, had to follow to ensure that everything remained moral and adhered to the American Christian values. All the major film studios came to be governed by this code, which required that their films be wholesome and encouraged correct thinking amongst the general public. Any sinful behaviour was to be kept out of cinema, and that very much included homosexuality, of course. In the early days of the Hays Code, any mention whatsoever of homosexuality was swept under the rug. It was not even to be alluded to. But soon studios came up with a whole new way to represent the gays in film. They were to be the villains. Now we're going to be obviously exploring this in much deeper detail later in the episode, but for decades villains in movies and on TV to an extent would be queer coded, implied to be committing horrific crimes because of their sexuality. So gay equals villain, gay equals bad. And just a quick definition of queer coding as well, because I know not everyone will be aware. Queer coding is a subtextual coding of a character in the media as queer. So it's not explicitly said or confirmed within the piece of work this person is queer, but instead they're coded as so through a use of traits and stereotypes that are recognisable to the audience. Very, very often nowadays, characters will be coded as queer in ways that only the queer community will recognise, without it ever being explicitly stated. And the creators know what they're doing when this happens. It's not accidental. Most of the time, queer-coded characters are meant to be that way. It's kind of a way to include queer characters or even just capture the attention of the LGBTQ plus community without the straight viewers necessarily realising what's going on. Again, we'll explore this more later in the video, but queer coding is a really interesting concept, and what it is today was born out of the Hays Code. And just a quick side note before we get on with the rest of the video, because I know if I don't say this I'll get comments about it. I myself identify as a queer woman. I am queer. I am comfortable using that term to describe myself, and when talking about queer coding and queer history, there's sort of no getting around that term. I know some people aren't comfortable with how it's being reclaimed in today's society. That is on you, boo. You do you. But there's no getting around it. That's how I identify. It's how others identify. And so I am going to be using the word. If it makes you uncomfortable, I'm really sorry. The story of the Hays Code really begins in Hollywood in the 1920s. It's the Roaring Twenties. The world, the USA specifically, have just come out of the Great War and the Spanish flu. Industry is booming in the USA. Confidence throughout the country is at an all-time high. It was a time of great frivolity, drinking and partying and general happiness, and that was very much reflected in the movies that were coming out of Hollywood in this time. By the end of the 20s, silent films were becoming a thing of the past, and in the 30s, talkies had taken over, meaning that a lot more could be portrayed in a film. But even before that point, before talkies, Hollywood was getting pretty racy. Films were dealing with more adult content than ever before, showing crazy immoral things like women in positions of power and women making their own choices. I mean, just look at Marlene Dietrich, for example, who'd often dress in masculine clothing, and she was bisexual herself. She was huge in Hollywood. As well as this, drugs and alcohol were alluded to often in films, although they were rarely actually shown on screen, and many movies included scenes of partying and overindulgence. Soon, complaints started pouring in from the general public, people scandalised by what they were seeing on the big screen. I mean, won't somebody think of the children? I mean, as well as this, Hollywood has seen quite a few real life scandals in recent years as well. I've covered on my channel before the still unsolved murder of director William Desmond Taylor in 1922, a case which all kinds of famous names at the time were brought into. And there was also the Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle scandal as well, a silent film actor and comedian who was accused of the rape and murder of young actress Virginia Rapp. As well as this, you have movie stars dying left, right, and centre of drug overdoses. It was becoming a media frenzy, and something had to be done to clean up Hollywood's image. And this was a really tricky situation because it was these kinds of scandals and the promiscuity of the films that kept moviegoers coming back to watch. That's what people paid money to see. But on the other hand, you had the more religious of society, the more conservative, clutching at their pearls, sure that the questionable morals displayed in these movies would destroy society as a whole. So pressure began to be put on the government to do something about the films, and so political pressure rose. In 1921 alone, legislators in 37 states included almost 100 film censorship bills. And this was very hard for the film studios to keep up with. They had to figure out what was allowed in what state, what had to be edited where, and there were new bills coming in all the time. And it was a worry that the federal government was about to step in and censor films as a whole, so much so that films could no longer be made, or maybe they were just going to ban them completely. So the film studios decided to take matters into their own hands. They hired a man called William Haze, who was basically put in charge of self-regulating the studios. He was a Presbyterian elder, a man who was very high up in the church, and he was the former head of the Republican National Committee. As you can imagine, him and his team had some pretty strong religion-induced opinions over what was moral and what was not, what the general public should be allowed to see in their movies. In 1924, Haze introduced a set of recommendations that he called the Formula, that he advised the studios to follow. This wasn't a law or anything like that, it was just recommendations, but he did also ask that filmmakers ran the plot of their films by his office before they went into production. But this didn't really make all that much difference. The stakes weren't very high, filmmakers were still going to make what they wanted to make. Haze didn't really have enough power. But Hollywood hoped that this alone would be enough to prove to Congress and the wider public that they had tried to clean up their act. But things actually seemed to get more scandalous in the early 1930s rather than less. The Roaring Twenties were coming to an end and the Great Depression was really beginning to take hold. People had less spare income to spend on the movies, so the film studios had to work really hard to entice people in. Obviously, the more salacious, the more risque, the more violent the content, the more likely people would be to come in and see it. Movies had a clear focus in this time on gangsters, violence and sex, and clearly William Haze was failing in his mission. It's here in around 1930 that the Haze Code in all its glory is formed. Now, a lot of the sources I read quote different implementation dates of this, but just know we're looking at around the early 1930s. The Haze Code, named after William Haze, was a colloquial name for the motion picture production code, but you might have also heard it referred to as the Breen Code as well, after Joseph Breen. Joseph Breen worked for the Motion Producers and Distributors of America, and he was mostly in charge of assuring that this code was implemented. The code also came to be known as the Decency Code as well, it had lots of different names. But we'll keep calling it the Haze Code. In the Haze Code, there'd be 36 don'ts and be careful recommendations made. Now, I'll leave a document linked down below where you can read each and every recommendation in the Haze Code. It's literally the actual Haze Code document. And I'm going to read out some, but me reading out all of them will make for a pretty boring episode, so I'm just going to share the highlights. The Haze Code was based on 3 general principles: that no picture should lower the moral standards of those who see it, so essentially the sympathy of the audience should never lie with the villain or on the side of crime or sin. Number 2 is correct standards of life subject only to the requirements of drama and entertainment shall be presented, and law that's natural or human shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. So, for example, no law should ever be represented as unjust. So that's kind of the main framework under which filmmakers were working, but there were also several subsections to be followed as well, of course. So it was no vulgarity, whether that's facial expressions or words, and similarly no obscenity, so no swear words or obscene gestures were allowed. The words Jesus, Christ, God, Lord, etc. were never to be mentioned outside scenes set in church or other religious settings. No film would be allowed to throw ridicule on any religious faith, and ministers of religion should not be used in comedy or as villains, or even just shown to be unpleasant people. Of course, there was absolutely no nudity, and semi-nudity was only allowed under certain conditions, but semi-nudity back then had different connotations than it does now. In the Haze Code, it's literally referring to things like legs, arms, shoulders and back. Can't see any of those things. It says the human body must be covered with opaque material at all times. One part of the code that made me laugh a bit was actually reference to dance costumes, in which it says dance costumes are to be cut to permit grace or freedom of movement, but anything that showed movement of breasts or movement of sexual suggestions of the intimate parts of the body are a big no-no. I mean, dance in general has a whole section in the Haze Code. There was no obscene dancing allowed that suggests or represents sexual action, whether that's solo or partnered. The can-can is specifically mentioned as not being allowed, as well as belly dancing. The locations where the scenes are set were also subject to review. Anything associated with sexual life or sexual sin was not allowed. So obviously there's no brothels, but you also had to be very careful about featuring bedrooms in your movies. It reads, in themselves they are perfectly innocent, however under certain conditions they are bad dramatic locations. Their use in a comedy or farce is wrong because they suggest sex laxity and obscenity. So any scenes in a bedroom must feature fully covered characters, so we're talking full neck to ankle kind of jammies. As well as all this, crime was also obviously a big no-no. Methods of crime shall not be explicitly presented, so there's no scenes of theft, robbery, arson, firearms, drugs. Nothing was to be shown on screen, but it seems these things could be alluded to as long as the criminal in question got punished appropriately. Even liquor, alcohol, could not be used unless required by the plot or for the proper characterisation. And then we come onto the sex section, which is the most relevant to the angle of this episode. This section starts with, the sanctity of the institution of marriage and the home shall be upheld. Pictures shall not infer that low form of sex relationship are the accepted or common thing. Adultery must not be explicitly treated or justified or presented attractively out of regard for the sanctity of marriage. I mean, in this section, even the very popular trope of love triangles were called into question, saying they had to be carefully handled. Scenes of passion must be treated with an honest acknowledgement of human nature and its normal reasons. So it reads, many scenes cannot be presented without arousing dangerous emotions on the part of the immature, the young, or the criminal classes. Essentially, you can't have anything that's going to turn anyone on. And this was further expanded on in the next point that says there's no excessive or lustful kissing, no lustful embraces, and no suggestive postures and gestures. And this is kind of a big question I have about the Haze Code in general, because it all seems so subjective. What is a lustful embrace? I mean, in the eyes of a very, very religious person, how does a simple hug between a man and woman, the opposite sexes, separate itself from a lustful embrace? How do you make that distinction? I'm sure it just came to a point where there were no hugs really allowed at all. Alongside this, we also have miscegenation being forbidden, which is the sexual relationship between white and black people. There were to be no representation whatsoever of interracial couples. Not so fun fact, this point was actually very much used by racist filmmakers to just exclude non-white actors from their movies as a whole, saying that they couldn't have mixed race lead couples, so they're just going to go for all white cast to avoid breaking any rules. This was despite there actually being a clause within the code that actually advocated for the inherent dignity of foreign peoples and said that other cultures should not be undeservedly slurred. Of course though, this was very up for interpretation and the white leaders of Hollywood were very happy to use it as an excuse for a bit of racism. There were also clauses saying sex hygiene and general diseases were not subject to motion pictures and no scenes of actual childbirth either. I wonder if this could have anything to do with very high teenage pregnancy rates. There's a clause saying no white slavery. Tellingly, I see no mention of black slavery, of course. And there's actually another point that I very much agree with. Children's sex organs are never to be exposed. I suppose that clause, that singular clause, is a shining light within a otherwise very restrictive set of guidelines. And here we move on to perhaps the most relevant part for this particular video, this episode, and that's the clause, sex perversion or any inference to it is forbidden. That's it, that's the entire line, and this is the line that still affects queer representation in movies and TV, all media really, to this very day. They didn't need to expand upon this because everyone knew to which sexual perversion referred: homosexual relationships. Homosexual relationships were not to be alluded to in any circumstances. It was a big no to the gays. And just like that, gays were wiped from the public eye, deemed perverts, not to be part of mainstream culture. For a little bit anyway. Now, the Haze Code was supposed to be voluntary. It wasn't law, and filmmakers generally picked and chose as to whether they wanted to follow it or not. But it did have repercussions if they didn't, because a lot of cinemas or theatres wouldn't show the movies if they didn't follow the rules. And who would make a film no one was going to go see? I mean, that didn't stop some though. You still had gangster movie Scarface come out in 1932, and the following year you had Babyface, which is about a young woman who used her sexual allure to get what she wanted out of life. It wasn't really until 1934 when the Haze Code started to be taken really seriously, because that's when the Catholic Church got involved. Well, I suppose actually the Catholic Church was always involved in this. The original document was written with very Catholic undertones, but it was originally decided to keep the Catholic influence here a secret. Author Gregory Black wrote in his 1996 book, Hollywood Censored, that the code was a fascinating combination of Catholic theology, conservative politics, and pop psychology. An amalgam that would control the content of Hollywood for 3 decades. When in the early 1930s it was clear that filmmakers were still picking and choosing when to follow the code, the Catholic Legion of Decency got involved, and this legion was created as a counterpart to the code to ensure that the threat of a Catholic boycott of Hollywood movies would keep filmmakers on the straight and narrow. The Catholic Church at this time in the USA consisted of around 20 million people who mostly lived in the cities and urban centres, and it had its own national press with more than 6 million readers weekly. It had a huge influence on society. If the Catholic Church told their followers to boycott the movies, it would happen. The Legion created a new scale on which to rate films, from A to C. A was for morally unobjectionable, but even within that there were 4 sub-ratings, from acceptable to all to acceptable for adults with reservations. B was morally objectionable in part, and C was condemned. If a movie was condemned, that was it, no theatres would show it, and it was from that point that movie producers and filmmakers lived in fear of a condemned rating. From then on, filmmakers inside the major studios were kind of forced to follow the code. As you can imagine, this had a huge effect on the media that was being released. I mean, even cartoon characters like Betty Boop, who started off as this flapper girl dancing and just a generally very interesting character, was forced to become nothing more than a housewife character fully covered up. There was a 1934 movie called Tarzan and His Mate, in which there were very brief nude scenes. They had to be edited out, obviously. Even classics such as Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca weren't immune from this. The plot of Rebecca is essentially a man who killed his first wife, and the narrator, his current wife, discovers this and makes light of it. In Alfred Hitchcock's 1940 movie adaptation of this though, obviously that storyline was not allowed. You couldn't make light or comedy out of crime, and it certainly couldn't show a character getting away with murder. So in Hitchcock's version, Rebecca died in an accident, and her widower was just guilty of hiding the facts of her death. The entire story was basically changed to abide by these rules. I mean, even 1947's Miracle on 34th Street, one of the most classic Christmas movies ever made, barely scraped by with a B rating from the Catholic Legion because of its sympathetic depiction of a divorced woman. I mean, that's just a couple of examples, but for years, filmmakers were very much bound by the code's restrictions. That's until they realised they just had to get creative. Several filmmakers of the time said that the Haze Code actually helped their storytelling techniques. They had to find more creative ways around the Haze Code. Hilariously, a lot of the time filmmakers did include small nods to sex or drugs or partying that they just hoped would go completely over the heads of the people reviewing at the Catholic Legion. And a lot of the time they did. These Catholic people were sort of hidden away from the darker side of society. They missed a lot of the references that they probably should have picked up on. And now I'm not talking about Catholicism as a whole there, I'm specifically referring to the people who were reviewing these movies. They were very Catholic. And as World War II came to an end and TV started to become a lot more popular, it became harder for the reviewers to rein film and TV makers in. Movies now had to compete with TV that they never had to before, and if that meant the filmmakers had to take risks, they were going to do it. Plus, there's the very, very basic fact that the bad topics just make for a more enticing movie. Nobody wants to go watch a boring movie where nothing happens, just a movie about a family sitting around for dinner. You've got to have excitement, you've got to have high stakes, otherwise what's the point? You can have just as much entertainment literally sitting around for dinner with your own family. I mean, this isn't to shit on movies from this time, because this literally was the golden era of Hollywood, but I'm sure we can all agree that a lot of the storylines of these films were just a bit dull. And still, whilst filmmakers were making nods to a lot of the banned guidelines, homosexuality was still a big taboo. That is until they realised they could use the gays in movies. They would make the perfect villains. Now, of course, you still couldn't outright say that the character was a gay man, but what you could do was queer code them, give them queer characteristics to make them less sympathetic in the eyes of the viewers, and this worked perfectly. And here is kind of the age-old question: is any queer representation on screen, even if it is in a very negative light, better than no representation at all? Well, that's kind of up for the individuals to decide. But in this particular scenario, I lean towards no representation at all being better. Homosexuality only being portrayed in a negative light to society for 3 whole decades is something which I'm sure still has repercussions being felt today. One of the directors who took advantage of this was, of course, Alfred Hitchcock, whose 1948 movie Rope was about 2 friends who kill a classmate because they think they're better than him. However, it's alluded to that the killers are more than just friends, and Hitchcock hints that the reason for their murderous ways stems from their homosexuality. The Haze Code meant this couldn't be outright said, but it could be insinuated, it could be hinted at, as long as it was negative. And this would lead to a long line of movies where villains were always made to be slightly effeminate men, and something that really sticks out once you notice it. One of the biggest perpetrators of this are Disney. Disney are the main offenders when it comes to queer coding villains, and once you start to see it, you absolutely cannot unsee it. Governor Ratcliffe in Pocahontas wears makeup and has braided hair with bows. Scar in The Lion King is much more effeminate than his big strong brother Mufasa, and he does the little gay gestures, he does the hand flip, the delicate movements. Captain Hook in Peter Pan is undeniably effeminate. Even Ursula in The Little Mermaid is widely known to be based off the drag queen Divine. Ursula wasn't even a male character, but she was still a villain, and therefore, let's base her off someone gay. And this isn't even something of the past. The first time I saw Moana from 2016, it struck me how once again the character of Tamatoa is undeniably effeminate, obsessed with looking pretty and collecting shiny things. Do I think this is something consciously done by Disney even as late as 2016 in Moana? I very much hope not, but maybe. If not, it does go to show how deep the Haze Code went and how it does still affect media today. Eventually, the Haze Code did come to a natural end, having to fight with TV and foreign films. TV was subject to regulations, but it was much harder to censor, and any foreign films would have to be edited before being shown in US cinemas. And it was very clear they were missing out on a lot of money by having to do this. A lot of foreign film directors didn't want their films shown in the USA. And then in 1954, there was a case put in front of the Supreme Court that ruled that motion pictures were entitled to First Amendment protection, freedom of speech and freedom of religion. The film in question in this court case was called The Miracle, which was a short film imported from Italy that had very religious overtones. So it's about this girl living in the mountains who's convinced that she meets St. Joseph and she asks him to take her to heaven. Instead, the stranger gives her a lot of wine and it's implied that he rapes her. When she discovers that she's pregnant, she thinks it's divine conception. You can kind of see why the overlords of motion picture didn't like this one and they tried to ban it, but the Supreme Court said no. This ruling now meant as a whole that film was entitled to freedom of speech protections, and seeing as the Haze Code was originally brought in because the studios were scared of government censorship, and it was now very clear that the government weren't going to censor the films, what were they going to do? The Haze Code was no longer needed. It didn't really have a leg to stand on anymore. Over the next decade, more explicit films would start to be shown in cinemas, and by the late 1960s, it became very clear that enforcement was now impossible. The Haze Code was abandoned entirely by 1968. And throughout the 1970s, you would see a number of cult horror films being made, and the boom in this genre was very simple. It was because now directors could create these kinds of movies and no one was going to stop them. Sex, drugs, alcohol, horror, and more were now all fair game, and movie makers ran with it. Of course they would. Homosexuality, though, still very taboo. It could now be mentioned more explicitly. If a director wanted to include a gay couple, they could, but it was very, very rarely done. And even if it was done, it would still often be met with boycotts. And then in the 1980s, the AIDS crisis hit and homosexuality became synonymous with death and disease, a punishment from God, people called it. But just hear me out for 1 second. If homosexuality had been normalised over the previous few decades, instead of being ignored, shamed, villainised, how would the AIDS crisis have been treated differently? Would the leaders, and Ronald Reagan, I'm looking at you, have been more willing to admit there was a problem, be more willing to say the word gay out loud, get the message out about this deadly disease sooner? Of course, this is all speculation, you can't change history, but this whole thing went a lot deeper than just let's not mention the gays. It led to death. Which I suppose actually brings us very nicely onto the next thing that I wanted to touch upon, which is the ever so common bury the gays trope, which is another thing that directly harks back to the Haze era. Towards the end, when restrictions started to drop, gays could be mentioned, only if their ending was unhappy. And so the bury the gays trope originated as a way for queer writers to write queer narratives without being seen as endorsing homosexuality. And it seems it just stuck. And the movies didn't just end in death, most often it did, but other times you had asylums, breakups, people going back to their happy heterosexual marriages. Homosexuality had to be seen as something that led to misery. And sadly, the killing off of gay characters, actually mostly lesbian or bisexual women, is something that is still very prevalent in media today. As a gay woman, you know to be very careful before getting attached to a gay character on TV because chances are very, very high that they're going to end up dead. And this is something that happens all the time. I mean, just off the top of my head, let's share a few examples, and apologies if any of these things are spoilers, but they've all been out a while. So you have Lexa in the 100, you have Tara in Buffy, Marissa in the OC, Maya and Sarah Harvey in Pretty Little Liars, Naomi in Skins, which was insane, still stupid to this day, Adam in Degrassi, who is actually trans, you have Oberyn in Game of Thrones, Rose in Jane the Virgin, and that one's double whammy because she was gay and a villain, Danny in The Haunting of Bly Manor, and Jesus Christ, that one still hurts. I could keep going, you get my gist. The gays always die. Yes, I know I'll get people in the comments saying they kill straight characters too. Obviously, I'm aware of that. I watch TV, I know they kill straight characters. But killing off the only gay characters in a movie or show consistently, it's become a trend. It's become expected. And it's not something you notice until you do, and it's very similar to the villain trope. Then you see it and you can't ignore it. There was actually a whole petition made to make filmmakers take note of this, and after the Lexa debacle of the 100, people were absolutely outraged. I mean, in the 100, they spent seasons building up this love story between two women, and then as soon as something finally happened, they killed one of them off. The writer was actually forced to come forward and apologise for this, saying that the bury the gays trope wasn't something he was aware of beforehand, but now he was, and he'd never do it again. But that's the dangerous thing, isn't it? Like, things like this becoming so ingrained in society and popular culture that it's repeated without anyone ever realising what they're doing. And it all stems, obviously, from the Haze Code. We do have more hope though. I mean, each year there's more wonderful LGBTQ+ movies being released with less death and less destruction and less trauma. And I know we'll get there eventually, but it's slow. There are so many angles and lenses you can look at something like this from, but of course, being a queer woman myself, I'm always going to analyse things through the lens of queerness. It's how I see things first and foremost. But of course, there are a wealth of other analysi of this whole era online and on YouTube. There are so many wonderful podcasts about this, so if you do want to go and dive even deeper into the Haze Code, then please do. It is honestly fascinating from every angle. So to round off, the Haze Code was very much a product of its time, and I think you can have a much deeper understanding of the golden age of Hollywood when you know about this. It's always crazy to me how much power Christianity, Catholicism in particular, has over history. The thought of society being so controlled by religion is crazy to me as an atheist person, but maybe that is still how we live today and it's just not as clear when you're living it. I personally think separation of church and state is so important, but then again, this wasn't government controlled. This was the studios doing what they could so the government didn't control them. I could honestly keep going, I could analyse all this all over again, but I'll end it there. Thank you so much for watching and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.